Welcome to Unshakable Serenity. Today we're going to talk about a topic that may seem controversial at first glance, but is actually deeply rooted in the principles of Stoic philosophy. The types of people you should never help. Have you ever wondered why, no matter how hard you try to help someone, the situation never seems to get better or worse? Why in some cases your help seems to make things worse? If you've ever been there, know that you're not alone. And most importantly, it's not necessarily your fault. In Stoic philosophy, there's a concept called oikeiosis, our natural inclination to care for ourselves and, by extension, others. We are social and cooperative beings by nature. Marcus Aurelius himself reminds us, we were made to cooperate like the feet, the hands, the eyelids, the upper and lower rows of teeth. This cooperation is at the heart of what it means to be human. However, the Stoics also deeply value discernment. Not all help is beneficial. Sometimes what appears to be helpful can actually harm the person we are trying to help, creating dependency, reinforcing destructive behaviors, or compromising our own core values. When we struggle with anxiety, depression, or emotional fragility, it's even more important to know when and how to direct our energy. Offering help without criteria can not only drain our already limited emotional reserves, but it can also hinder the growth of others. There's a paradox here. To be truly compassionate, we sometimes need to refuse help. To promote genuine good, we need to set clear boundaries. And to honor our nature as social beings, we need to know when to step back. Today, we're going to explore 5 types of people who, according to Stoic principles, you should never help, at least not in the way we normally understand help. This isn't a list of people to avoid or judge, but rather situations where true help can mean something completely different than what we imagine. Shall we get started? Before we get to the first type, why not subscribe to our channel? That way, you won't miss a single video. First type, people who consistently reject their own moral responsibility. Imagine a friend who always has an excuse. Nothing is his fault. Did he lose his job? His boss was harassing him. Did he break up with his partner? Did he have impossible financial problems? The economy is against him. This recurring pattern of passing the buck is the first warning sign we should watch for. For the Stoics, few things were as fundamental as personal responsibility. Epictetus, who was born a slave and suffered immensely throughout his life, nevertheless insisted, "It is not things that trouble men, but their opinions about things." In other words, it is not external events that determine our happiness or suffering, but how we choose to interpret and respond to them. When we encounter people who consistently refuse to take responsibility for their choices and actions, we face a dilemma. Our natural inclination is to help, to offer support, to find solutions. But ask yourself, what really happens when you help someone who refuses to acknowledge their own role in their problems? More often than not, you unwittingly become an accomplice to an illusion. You reinforce a destructive belief that problems always come from outside, that one is perpetually a victim of circumstances, and that the solution must also come from external sources. You, in this case, consider this example. Your friend is constantly struggling financially because he spends more than he earns. Every time he can't pay the rent, you help him out. It sounds kind, right? But if he never acknowledges that his spending behavior is a problem, your help actually prevents him from confronting the real cause of his situation. Stoic philosophy offers us a different approach. Epictetus also taught, remember that you are an actor in play of such a nature as the author chooses. If short, short. If long, long. What does this mean in practice? That we should accept our circumstances, the role we've been given, but exercise our moral freedom in the choices we make, how we interpret that role. When someone refuses to accept this responsibility, the real help is not in solving their immediate problems, but in supporting them to see their own power of choice. This may mean allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their actions. It may sound harsh, but it is deeply compassionate at its core. How can you recognize when you're dealing with this type of situation? Look for repetitive patterns. See if the same crises occur over and over again. Pay attention to language. Words like always, never, everyone often signal a distorted view of responsibility. Most importantly, notice when your attempts to help never lead to lasting change. The next time you encounter someone who constantly externalizes blame, remember, Your most valuable help may not be to solve the immediate problem, but to gently encourage the person to realize his or her own role and power in the situation. Second type, those who never give back or show gratitude. Everything in life has a natural rhythm of giving and receiving. The tides rise and fall. The seasons change in predictable cycles, and living beings exist in a web of interdependence. The Stoics recognize this reciprocity as part of the natural order of things, of the logos that governs the universe. In human relationships, this balance manifests itself through gratitude and reciprocation. Seneca, in his treatise on benefits, explored the importance of gratitude at length. He wrote, "He who receives a benefit with gratitude already begins to return it." For the Stoics, gratitude was not just a social courtesy, but a fundamental virtue that reflected our understanding of human interconnectedness. But we've all encountered people who seem to have their hands perpetually outstretched, always ready to take, but never to give. I'm not talking about people in genuinely difficult circumstances who temporarily need more than they can give. I'm talking about those for whom this has become a pattern of life. People who consistently take your time, energy, resources, or emotional support without ever showing appreciation or willingness to give back when they can. How does this manifest itself in everyday life? It's the friend who only calls when they need something, the colleague who's always asking for favors, but disappears when you need help, the family member who accepts your support as if it were an obligation, without ever saying a simple thank you. Why is it problematic to continue helping these people? This isn't a business transaction where we demand payment for our services. It's about honoring what the Stoics called oikiosis, our natural sense of belonging to the human community. When someone consistently takes without acknowledging or giving back, they're not simply being ungrateful. They're rejecting the fundamental bonds that connect us as human beings. Seneca would argue that continuing to offer help in these circumstances is not generosity, but a disservice. Nothing is more unworthy than consider someone worthy of a benefit who shows no gratitude. By allowing someone to remain in a mode of receiving only, you're allowing them to avoid developing the virtue of gratitude, which is essential to their own flourishing as a human being. How can you spot this pattern? Look at the history of your relationship with the person. Does the interaction always flow in one direction? When you express your own needs, do they respond with indifference or even resentment? Does the person assume that their help will always be available without ever acknowledging the cost to you? Stoic philosophy teaches us that stopping to help in these cases is not an act of pettiness, but of justice to the other person and to yourself. By setting boundaries, you create space for the other person to develop the capacity for gratitude and reciprocation, qualities necessary for truly healthy relationships. As Seneca reminds us, gratitude is a virtue that does not merely reciprocate, but also acknowledges. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to learn to recognize the value of human reciprocity. Third type, people who abuse your goodwill. The lines between helping and being exploited are not always clearly visible. Often, we start out with genuine goodwill, only to gradually discover that we have crossed an invisible boundary. Before we know it, we are deeply involved in a pattern where our kindness is systematically exploited. The Stoics value generosity as a natural expression of human virtue. However, they also understood that virtue must be exercised with wisdom and discernment. Marcus Aurelius warned, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." This moral clarity extends not only to our own actions, but also to how we allow others to interact with us. How do you recognize when your goodwill is being abused? The signs may be subtle at first. Maybe it's that person who always has an emergency that only you can handle, or the person who constantly pushes the boundaries you set, testing how far they can go. It could be the friend who turns simple requests into increasingly larger demands, or the family member who uses guilt and emotional manipulation to get what they want. Think about the co-worker who repeatedly leaves her tasks for you to finish because she knows you won't leave the job undone, or the acquaintance who only shows up when she needs a favor, always with a convincing story about why you're the only one who can help. What makes this behavior particularly exhausting is the way it often disguises itself as a legitimate need. The person may express effusive gratitude in the moment, but then quickly comes back with another request another crisis, another reason why you should stretch yourself beyond your limits. For the Stoics, setting boundaries was not about selfishness, but about moral clarity. Epictetus taught, "It is not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters." When we allow others to abuse our goodwill, we are not only harming ourselves, but also enabling behaviors that are harmful to the person doing the exploiting. Marcus Aurelius offers a powerful perspective on how to approach these situations. The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Translated into our context, the best response to manipulation is not to manipulate back or react in anger, but to set clear, firm boundaries with inner calm. How do you set these boundaries in a Stoic way? First, clearly identify where your limits should be, what you are willing and unwilling to do. Second, communicate these limits calmly and directly, without accusations or anger. Third, and perhaps most importantly, hold firm to these limits even when tested. Here's a practical example. I understand that you are in a difficult situation, and I care about your well-being. However, I cannot continue to lend you money. I am willing to help in other ways, such as offer realistic alternatives. Remember that setting boundaries doesn't mean abandoning compassion. In fact, healthy boundaries can be an expression of true compassion for both yourself and the other person. By refusing to engage in exploitative dynamics, you create space for more authentic, balanced relationships. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste the rest of your life worrying about what other people think, unless it contributes to the common good." Setting boundaries is ultimately a contribution to the common good. You preserve your ability to help in truly meaningful ways, and you give the other person the opportunity to develop healthier relationships. Fourth type, those who refuse to make any effort to help themselves. There is a Stoic fable attributed to Hierocles that perfectly illustrates the principle we are now going to explore. A man found a fallen bird with a broken wing. He took it home, treated its wounds, and cared for it until it was healed. When it was time to release it, the bird refused to fly, preferring the safety and comfort of being fed and sheltered. The man then realized that his continued help had become an obstacle to the bird fulfilling its nature as a winged being. With firm compassion, he stopped hand-feeding it, placing the food farther and farther away until the bird finally rediscovered its ability to fly. This story captures an essential truth of Stoic philosophy. There's a fundamental difference between helping someone who is temporarily incapacitated and perpetuating the inaction of someone who is capable but unwilling. Musonius Rufus, one of the great Stoic teachers, regularly emphasized the importance of personal effort. It is impossible to learn to live well through instruction alone, without active practice. In our journey through life, we inevitably encounter people who, although perfectly capable, refuse to make any effort to improve their own situation. I am not talking about those who struggle with real limitations or who need temporary support while they recover. I am talking about those who have adopted passivity as a way of life, who expect others to solve their problems while they remain comfortably inactive. How can you spot this pattern? Look at the balance between effort and expectation. Does the person expect significant results without investing corresponding energy? Does he or she always have an excuse for not taking the next step, no matter how small? Does the person regularly ignore practical suggestions, preferring to lament his or her situation? Consider the friend who constantly complains about his or her weight, but rejects any suggestion of dietary changes or physical activity. Or the colleague who laments his or her professional stagnation, but never seeks to improve his or her skills or expand his or her knowledge. Or the acquaintance who is always unhappy with his or her relationships, but refuses to reflect on his or her own patterns of behavior. What happens when we continue to help these people? First, we reinforce the limiting belief that they are incapable of solving their own problems, a deeply disempowering message. Second, we prevent the development of self-efficacy, the confidence in one's ability to face challenges that is essential for psychological well-being. Third, we create a dynamic of dependency that eventually exhausts both the helper and the helped. Epictetus, who overcame extremely adverse circumstances in his life, was emphatic. It is not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters. When we take on responsibility that belongs to someone else, we deprive that person of the opportunity to develop resilience through active response to difficulties. This doesn't mean completely abandoning someone who is struggling. The Stoic approach suggests a middle path, offering guidance rather than ready-made solutions, providing support for the person's efforts, not replacing them, celebrating small progress rather than solving big problems. As Musonius Rufus taught, it is better to need less than have more. Applied to helping relationships, this suggests that it is better to cultivate the other's independence than to constantly increase the support we offer. Some practical strategies. Set clear expectations about what you are willing to do and what you expect a person to do for themselves. Offer support in progressively smaller steps. Recognize and celebrate when a person takes initiative, no matter how small. Be prepared to back off completely if necessary, always with compassion but also with firmness. Remember that for the Stoics, true help always aims at developing virtue and self-sufficiency. As Seneca wrote, "I wish you'd have control over yourself, that your mind may gather itself and prepare itself for events, and that you may not worry yourself by imagining that there are more difficulties in things than there really are." The greatest help we can offer someone is to create the conditions for them to discover their own strength, capacity, and resilience. Sometimes this means taking a step back and allowing the person to experience the discomfort necessary for growth. Fifth type, people who want you to violate your own moral principles. At the heart of Stoic philosophy is an unshakable conviction. Virtue is the only true good. Not wealth, not pleasure, not social recognition, only virtue. For the Stoics, living according to sound moral principles was not one choice among many, but the very purpose of human existence. Epictetus expressed it with crystal clarity. First tell yourself what you would be, then do what you must do. This simple yet profound statement highlights the primacy of moral integrity, knowing your core values and acting consistently with them, regardless of the circumstances. As we journey through life, we will inevitably encounter people who ask us to compromise our moral principles in the name of helping them. Maybe it's a friend asking you to lie for them, a family member asking you to ignore hurtful behavior, a co-worker asking you to participate in something unethical just this once, an acquaintance expecting you to abandon your personal boundaries to meet their needs. These requests rarely come labeled as, "Please compromise your moral integrity for me." Instead, they come packaged in seemingly reasonable justifications. It's just a little white lie. No one will get hurt. You're the only person who can help. If you really cared about me. Emotional manipulation often accompanies these requests. The person may appeal to your sense of loyalty, trigger your fear of rejection, or evoke feelings of guilt. When we are emotionally fragile, struggling with anxiety or depression, for example, we may be particularly vulnerable to this form of pressure. However, the Stoics would warn us that compromising our moral principles, even with the best intentions, is an act of self-harm. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What difference does it make to you if other people praise you, but you are not worthy of your own praise?" In other words, external approval can never compensate for the loss of personal integrity. Furthermore, when we compromise our values to help someone, we are not really helping that person. We are reinforcing the belief that moral principles are negotiable, that the ends justify the means, and that solutions based on ethical violations are acceptable. In essence, we are supporting the development of vices, not virtues. How do you spot these problematic requests? Ask yourself, if this interaction were known to everyone, would I feel comfortable? Is this request in line with the person I'm striving to be? If someone I deeply respect knew about this, what would they think? Persistent discomfort is often a sign that something is at odds with your core values. Courage, one of the 4 cardinal virtues of Stoicism, is especially needed in these situations. It takes courage to say no when it would be easier to give in. It takes courage to risk disapproval for the sake of integrity. It takes courage to prioritize moral principles over momentary peace. As Epictetus taught, difficulties are what reveal men's character. When we face challenges that challenge our principles, we have the opportunity to demonstrate who we really are. In practice, this might mean saying, "I understand your difficult situation, and I care about you. However, I cannot do what you are asking because it goes against my core principles. I am willing to help in other ways that are consistent with my values." Always remember that true help never requires sacrificing your moral integrity. As Seneca advised, associate with those who will make you better. Receive those whom you can make better. Relationships that require you to compromise your principles do not fall into either of these categories. Your moral integrity is not a luxury to be sacrificed when inconvenient. It is a foundation upon which everything else in your life is built. Protecting it is not selfish. It is wisdom. As we explore these 5 types of people that Stoic philosophy suggests we should not help, at least not in a conventional way, it is essential to recognize some important nuances to avoid misunderstandings. First, not helping does not mean being cruel or indifferent. The Stoics deeply value compassion and the well-being of the human community. Epictetus stated, "He among you who neglects humanity neglects himself." The question is not whether we should care, but how we express that care in a way that genuinely benefits the other. Sometimes the most compassionate help comes in the form of firm limits. Other times, it manifests itself as a gentle refusal. In some cases, it means allowing someone to face the natural consequences of their choices. The goal is never punish or abandon, but to create conditions where true growth and moral development can occur. Second, people change. Someone who currently refuses to take responsibility may, after reflection and experience, develop greater self-awareness. A person who has been accustomed to exploiting the kindness of others may recognize the impact of their behavior and seek more balanced relationships. The Stoics will remind us not to permanently label people, but to observe current patterns of behavior and respond appropriately. Marcus Aurelius advised, "Be like the promontory against which the waves continually break, yet which stands firm and stills the raging waters around it." This suggests a stance of stability and openness, firm in our principles, but receptive to the possibility of change in others. Third, there is a natural tension between compassion and personal boundaries that we must constantly navigate. The Stoics value balance in all things. Seneca wrote, "We must therefore find a middle ground between these extremes, so that we may pursue a course that leads neither to indifference nor to extravagance." In practice, this means regularly evaluating whether our interactions are serving the genuine good, both ours and the other person's. Are we allowing harmful behaviors out of fear of conflict? Or are we being unnecessarily rigid in our boundaries when flexibility would be appropriate? One of the most important virtues in the Stoic tradition is phronesis, the practical wisdom or discernment that allows us to apply general principles to specific situations. There are no absolute rules about when to help and when to retreat. Each situation requires careful assessment and sound judgment. Finally, how we communicate our decision not to help is as important as the decision itself. The Stoics value clear, direct, and non-hostile communication. Instead of accusing, "You always exploit my kindness," we can express personal boundaries. "I'm not up for that right now." Instead of criticizing, "You never take responsibility," we can express observations. "I've noticed a pattern that concerns me." As Marcus Aurelius advised, if possible, teach them the better way. If not, remember that benevolence was given to you for this purpose. Even when we decide not to help in the way requested, we can maintain an attitude of genuine benevolence. Navigating these complexities isn't easy, especially when we're dealing with our own mental health challenges. Yet it's precisely through these difficult moral decisions that we develop the virtue the Stoics valued above all else. We've come to the end of our exploration of the 5 types of people that, according to Stoic philosophy, you should never help, at least not in a conventional way. Let's briefly revisit each of them. First, those who consistently reject their own moral responsibility, always shifting the blame to external factors. Second, those who never reciprocate or show gratitude, breaking the natural cycle of human reciprocity. Third, those who abuse your goodwill, turning your generosity into an obligation to be exploited. Fourth, those who refuse to make any effort to help themselves, preferring passivity to action. And fifth, those who ask you to compromise your moral principles in the name of help. It is important to remember that the purpose of this discussion is not to judge or condemn, but to apply practical wisdom to our relationships. As Epictetus taught, don't explain your principles, embody them. Our task is not to lecture on responsibility or gratitude, but to live in a way that exemplifies these values. As you apply these Stoic principles to your life, Remember that the true purpose of philosophy is to guide us toward a life of virtue and inner peace. Sometimes the path to this peace of mind involves difficult decisions and uncomfortable conversations. But as Marcus Aurelius reminds us, you have power over your mind, not over external events. Realize this, and you'll find strength. May you find the wisdom to discern when to help and when to retreat, the courage to set necessary boundaries, and the serenity to accept the consequences of your virtuous choices. If you liked the video, subscribe to our channel to continue receiving content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications and give it a like too, okay? See you in the next video.